Hopefully you guys will get a message and it's not a problem. Right, super. Let me try and share that screen. So we do that, and if I go to this one on my end, hopefully I can drive it from here. Right, but that does mean I can't see you, so do open your mics and shout if you want to say anything rather than raising hands, because I won't see you doing it. Right, I want to kick off. I want to jump straight in, guys, with this little clip about language. I'm not sure if you would have seen it before, but it's yeah, it's incredible. So let's just watch this first. Oh, it's at the end typically. Hang on.
The map.
There we go.
This is a map of someone's brain, showing roughly which areas respond when they hear different words. For example, there's a small area in the middle frontal gyrus that reliably responds to hearing the word top. But it's not just one word, one location. A single word can activate a whole range of different brain regions. So we find the word top in a bit of brain that seems to respond to words associated with clothing and appearances. Also here with numbers and measurements. And here with buildings and places. We usually think of language as being restricted to certain sections, like the temporal lobe. So researchers were surprised to find activity all across the brain and in both hemispheres. The map was made by scientists at the University of California, Berkeley. They put volunteers in an MRI scan and had them listen to stories for 2 hours.
Back in the front again, deep, deep, and she pulls out a pack of matches that have been laundered at least once.
By monitoring blood flow to different parts of the brain, they worked out which places were responding to the meaning of the words, the semantics. They found that different bits of the brain responded to different kinds of words and concepts. And they could group them into rough categories, shown here by the different colours. Dark green bits, for example, were most activated by words to do with numbers, red bits by social words. Here in the right temporoparietal junction, this speck of brain, just a few millimetres across, was found to respond to words like wife, mother, pregnant, and family. And this bit just next door responds to some of the same social words like family and wife, but also words to do with places and people like house and owner. Generally, the concepts represented in each brain region relate to other functions that scientists already know about. So words to do with how things look, such as stripes, are likely to be found near the visual cortex. And although each individual's map is different, looking at these three brains, it's clear that different people have the same kinds of concepts in the same kinds of places. This is the first time we've been able to map the semantic systems of the brain in such detail, discovering that words are grouped by meaning and revealing just how complicated and widespread the word maps in our heads really are. And the brain map is available online for anyone to explore.
Cool. So, there you go. Interesting stuff, huh? So, when we get to the topic of the day, which is this principle of Hitozukuri, and we find that it means build people or develop people, it's interesting to think about where those words might map in our heads and what it might mean. I mean, what does develop mean? Anyone? Have you got an opinion or a theory on what the word develop means?
Create. That comes to my mind.
Create, is that?
Improve from the current state.
Yeah. Okay, and what do we mean by people? Clues in the picture. So improving from the current state and people, and from my point of view, I mean, just I'm sure you guys kind of got a rough idea of my background, but 40 years in industry next year and 35 years studying philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. For me, it means neurological adaptation. right? And it links to issues like emotional maturity and emotional confidence. So if we're going to develop people and think about that principle of Hitozukuri in that sense, for me, it means developing brains, right? It means giving people the capacity to cope with life and the emotional response that triggers in a better way. And I think that's not the same way the Japanese see it, because they don't talk about neuroscience, but at a cultural level, just intuitively, there's that same kind of understanding. And I want to try and unpack on that a bit today. But through that lens, we don't really have to ask anymore, why do most leadership development programs fail to create sustained behavioral change? Because that's kind of one of the big things out there, isn't it? It's sustainability. And for me, the answer is obvious, because the training delivered normally focuses on describing technicalities and skills and processes, but it doesn't really focus on the real outcome objective, which is to create the conditions in which brains adapt and perform at their best and do what they do from that neurogenesis, neuroplasticity point of view, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, and giving brains the stimulus they need to trigger that adaptation. And what we've done is ignoring the brains over the years. It feels to me that we've designed an approach to training and education that hasn't got that facilitation of neural adaptation as its outcome objective. So it's the reason why I think is just because if you go back into the video we just watched, it's because we haven't got the language that we need to consider and describe that outcome objective wired into our brains yet. It just doesn't exist there because we haven't been talking about brains so much. And that's not really anybody's fault. It's the reality of where we are in our development cycle. I think as technology's evolved, so has our understanding of ourselves. And it only really took a massive turn in a positive way back in 2009, where Elizabeth Gould come up with this. She used changed the process from tritiated thymidine was an old cell tagging technique that was used, and she changed that to bromodioxyuridine cell tagging, and it allowed her to see in sort of dying throat cancer patients the fact that these new neurons were growing and integrating into the new neural mass in human brains even up until the last hours of life. So it wasn't until she got sort of approval from the ethics board and conducted those experiments with this chemical that we really could prove that brains changed and adapted based on its inbound sensory stimulus. And we'd never known that before. But then all of a sudden the sort of the light came on, everybody realized that's what was going on. And then neuroscience got a lot of backing financially all around the world from that point forward. So we're only really sort of 15, 16 years into having this kind of language at a sort of academic level. And today it's filtering into what everybody can understand. So it's no one's fault. There's no reason why, other than the fact it's just evolutionary process, that we haven't been able to consider brains and how they function up until now. But now we can, right? So it's really good because we can now look at this ancient wisdom, Hitozukuri principles that sit behind performance and practice, and really dig into it. So that's kind of what I want to do a little bit today, is try and explore that brain function bit and link it to these principles that have sat behind Toyota's success forever. So, or at least for the last 90 years. So let's just have another look at another little video. Watch this. Okay, so for a bit of context then, right, what's going on there? We know what the body needs, okay, oxygen, And if we don't get it, we burn out fast if we're working fast. And you can see it's a good example, right, of those basic principles, those biological principles showing in practice. If we go too fast, we burn out and we can't do as much. And if we take it steady, then it's that lean principle, right? And the tortoise and the hare parable, or whatever it might call it. But it's that idea that if we go slower, we can do more, right? We go slow to go fast. We know that about process flow balancing and all the stuff we've known about lean for all these years. But the same principle applies at a human level, and we see it very obviously when it's physical. But what about when it's mental? That's got to be the question. What's going on with the brain? What does the brain need to perform at its best? What do you reckon?
Positive reinforcement, probably wording.
Yeah, definitely. What about more biological?
Well, you mentioned oxygen, blood flow.
Exactly. So that's the kind of where I'm going with it. It's more from a biological point of view. The brain needs glucose energy, and that comes from carbohydrates. But obviously, it needs the oxygen to get rid of the free radicals and not get poisoned by the byproduct of that carbohydrate breakdown process where the free radicals get into the blood. So oxygen is crucial as well. But to actually power itself, it needs this glucose energy, right? And like you were saying, that positive reinforcement links back to the environment that it survives, what it's existing in. And really the primary things that a brain will respond negatively to is any kind of threat, and that can be to life status or ego if we kind of link it back to the psychological knowledge that we've got around us from the past. So that's really what we're talking about. There's this the brains, the neurons, like that critter you can see carrying that lamp there, they've got this energy and they've got to find their way through life, but the energy runs out. So there's something that happens, which is to survive efficiently, the brain takes shortcuts. So we'll come on to that in a minute. But so you just give you an impression of what this means, right? Because it's great words, but you've got to kind of see it to get it and really think about, crikey, this is happening inside me. So this is a little tiny zebra finch brain, right? It's only got 100,000 neurons in it. And there's a special technique that's been adapted in the last couple of years where you can see that each neuron, as it consumes that glucose energy, emits a small light. So we can see it in this particular test. And you see that that's 100,000 neurons lighting up, and whatever that zebra finch, almost sort of tiny embryo level size brain is processing from the world, it's consuming this glucose energy, right? There's the visual evidence of that happening. And you've got to think we've got 86 billion neurons with up to 10,000 synaptic connections on each neuron. So we've got that happening at this infinite scale. And that's why 20% of all the energy that our body produces from food gets consumed in the brain, right? But it's the same with anything. We've got this electrical and it's a chemical process. I'll come on to the chemical bit in a minute. But it's going to find the path of least resistance, right? And that means it's going to use the strongest wiring, the most established routes through the brain to process the world and survive. And that means we have false memories, we make assumptions, we jump to conclusions, we all have biases that we're not aware of and prejudice, and we make serious processing errors as well. So that's, when it comes to poker yoke and 5S and visual management and these kind of things in a factory setting, we're actually doing quite a lot to overcome the failings of the brain and the shortcuts it takes to conserve that glucose energy by helping the visual cortex be able to see more or notice differences, poker yoke, all that kind of things comes into it as well. So, to prove that, just quickly, look, you probably recognise her, do you? As Adele. Hopefully she's familiar to you and probably looks reasonably okay other than being upside down. But if we spin her over, you can see that your brain was tricking you because it expects to see eyes the right way around and lips the right way around. So you couldn't tell they're on upside down. And it's really hard to stop it doing it, even if you have been told that it's there, right? So these are the kind of things that when the brain's designed to take shortcuts to conserve glucose energy, these are the obvious things it can miss, right? And it's the same with this little image here. You can probably see a red Coke can, right? But it's not actually red. Your brain's telling you it's red because you expect to see a red Coke can. You zoom in and you can see that it's just black and white, right? And it doesn't matter if you zoom out and zoom in, it's just, it looks red, but it's actually black and white. So we make these mistakes, right? And like I said, there's also a chemical component to that. You've got the firing, which comes from the energy, the glucose energy, but the way that one neuron can connect to another is through chemicals, and we call them neurotransmitters. So there's quite a lot involved with this bit, which is because it's all linked to our fight, flight, stress. Cortisol is stress, and if that's too high, then it damages a substance called brain-derived neurotrophic factors, and that's essential for the brain to keep adapting and learning. So that neurogenesis process that Elizabeth Gould found out about, that slows right down and sometimes stops if you haven't got sufficient BDNF, and cortisol levels being too high kill BDNF. So if we're stressed, we don't change because, and we talk about digging our heels in and resistance to change. But actually, it's a chemical process we're talking about, and we just don't describe very well. And that stands true for all of our different emotions. So, I mean, there's a little gift there that just helps kind of put the point across. But it depends on the chemical release, and that at any one moment in time, based on whatever inbound sensory stimulus your brain is processing, determines what you feel like and how you describe your emotions at any moment in time. And what's interesting with that is each one of those words we saw in that first video mapped to the brain has to trigger chemical release if it's going to be activated. So how we talk and what we talk about has an emotional or capacity for an emotional response linked to it. So depending on where you saw those multiple words like bus linked to the different parts of the brain, depending on which part of the brain it engages for whatever reasons, because it's contextual, will determine what emotional response follows as well. So, I mean, that's what's really going on. So this is like a simple version, of this model. We're talking about BTFA. We're talking about belief is wiring. It's those neural representations of words and concepts that you just can't have if you haven't been exposed to it before. Thinking is the firing of that wiring, i.e., memory and being able to think of what you've seen before again, really is the thinking bit, the firing of the wiring. And then the feelings is the release of these chemicals. And these chemicals, we call them neurotransmitters when we talk about them in our head, but we talk about them as hormones when they're affecting and going between organs in our body. So a lot of them are the same chemicals, we just describe them differently, and that confuses everybody as well. But basically, everything that we go through in life is about this. So I'm whizzing through this pretty quickly because it's not really the main point of the conversation today. I want to get to the Hitozukuri stuff, but if we just add that all together and give it a really simple sort of representation and think about relationships and the quality of interaction between human beings being a big component part of culture, then we can see that if we've got this existing brain wiring and we call that a belief, and it fires, which we call thinking, and it uses this chemical component, which we call feeling, then the amount of work that the brain does in the background before we become conscious of it is immense. I mean, there's no real way of describing it, but I think David Rock did quite a good job when he said you've got more neural synapses in your brain than you have stars in the Milky Way, and the conscious part of your brain is about the same size as a 1 foot square cardboard box. So that kind of gives it some scale. So it's 99.99 something or another, parts of your brain is working subconsciously or pre-consciously, and you only get to be aware of what it's been doing to protect you in the world when it gets to that sort of into the prefrontal cortex and you become consciously aware of it. So we're acting and behaving almost on autopilot based on the brain's wiring and firing patterns, and it's all happening before we're even aware of it. So we see the product going late out the door and we go, come on lads, chop chop, let's get the job done, we've got to hit the targets, and that becomes the inbound sensory stimulus for the receiving brain, right? So this is when it starts to become about relationship, because that brain's got a different set of wiring patterns. The words, as we saw, are probably quite similar from a semantic meaning point of view, but they'll be mapped differently based on that individual's life experience. So that's going to land in a brain that's got a different set of beliefs fundamentally, so it's going to process it differently than our brain would, because it's also inbound rather than outbound sensory stimulus, and they're going to react, which is like, who the hell do you think you're telling me to? Have you seen what I've been going through today? Have you seen how hard we've been working? Why are you telling us to hurry up now? You know, so that whole capacity to have a negative response between people is all to do with this brain function and how it's all wired and firing. And I think when we recognize that some people react more defensively to anything new, we have to dig a little bit into the psychology behind that, and because the neuroscience backs all that up as well. So if you just think about it in terms of when we're born, we've got 25% neural mass. By the time we get to about 3 years old, that's 85%. So the first 3 years of life are phenomenally important in terms of imprinting. And psychologists talk about it in terms of biosurvival and emo-territorial imprinting phases, right? So what are we doing just to live and sleep and eat when we're tiny babies? And then as soon as we start crawling, walking, toddling, you know, getting out of nappies, whatever else it might be, what's going on with the brain there? And that's when you get into the sort of Freudian imprinting bits about advanced retreat and dominate, submit kind of axes that's imprinted by matriarchal and patriarchal input. So you've got all this, you know, lovely complicated language around psychology that says basically our brains form 40% is genetic, 60% is experiential, and the brain responds to, you know, its need to survive and defers to the powerful beings around us, the parent figures in most cases. And depending on how those parents try and impose control, usually out of love because they want to protect us, but it depends on how strongly they impose control, depends on whether the receiving brain gets a positive worldview, negative worldview, internal, external locus of control, and all these phrases come into it. And what that means is, you know, mum and dad turns around and says, you will eat your greens before you get down from the table, or screams at you and goes, what are you doing? Don't run out in front of that car, you silly little what's it, you know, because they're scared for you. So it's their emotional response, their brain's processing, going, you know, raising their voice, doing different physical motions with their hands to try and stop you from being in danger. So it's only done out of love in most cases, but the receiving brain, the child's brain, goes, oh, I'm not right in the world, I'm wrong, I'm not worthy, you know. So you end up with these insecurity issues deeply imprinted, quite often just because your parents are trying to do what's right by you. And we all carry that into adulthood as baggage that generically we call fear of failure and rejection, right? So this what, you know, psychologically we call inhibitive and compulsive destructive criticism, which is, you know, imposed control, links to this idea of, you know, these imprinted fears of failure and rejection. And that's how a lot of people respond to the world. So when, you know, the boss says, come on, let's hurry up, somebody with a low self-concept because of their childhood will react more emotionally, more negatively than somebody else that's got a, you know, a more rounded self-concept. And that's when we can really start thinking about, what does it mean to develop people? What does it mean to build people? And it means, and why I said at the beginning, for me, it links to emotional confidence and emotional maturity. It's because emotions are a chemical state-based reaction. And if people are in a confident space, they'll act more rationally and more in a more measured way to opportunities to improve, rather than seeing it as criticism which they have to defend against. And that's when we really start shifting culture. All right, so hopefully that will make sense. So if we look at, you know, just another little image of what it means for this to be taking place, and think about this in terms of, you know, a baby's brain, toddler, adolescent, prunes back a bit. We don't really finish forming our brain structures until we're about 24. That lasts until our late 40s, early 50s, and then it changes again, and we start using what we call sparse networks. And our brain changes the way it processes the world a little bit more. And we call it wisdom because we can start linking more things together. But, you know, through this whole process, it's always changing. And this little clip shows you what that looks like. So here's a few neurons. And what they do is they grow these branches that we call dendrites, and it's at the end of the dendrites and the axons, which is another tail that these neurons produce, where we get this synaptic connection. But you can see this is 1 week time lapse video. And it's like you say, you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's about 7 or 8 cell bodies there. But you look at the amount of branches they're growing in a week, right? And that's just going to be through, because this is a clinical method of triggering neural growth, it's going to be because of blue light being shone at them. So that's just one source of stimulus. When they're integrated in a brain, a living brain, they've got all of the different stimulus coming in from all of the different modalities, submodalities, senses, you know, your 5 key senses, and how they combine to trigger a response in the brain. So that growth rate would probably be a lot quicker in the brain. Okay, so that's what's going on. That's a basic overview of, you know, brains, how they work for all of us. There's no getting away from it. It's biology. You can't deny the facts. We've now got the science to know what we're talking about, and this is what we're dealing with when it comes to people and change, right? We have to trigger that kind of change in a brain if somebody's gonna change their behavior, because their behavior is only an output of their wiring and firing and chemical processing. It's nothing else. It can't be. So when we get to looking at, you know, statements from Fujio Cho, and he said we build people before we build cars, which is really that reflection of Hitozukuri, you know, incarnate, is how it comes out in practice. It gives this you know, view through the neuroscience lens, gives us a totally different view of the world, I think, because now we're talking about, although, like I said earlier, the Japanese don't describe what they do in neuroscience terms, but culturally, you know, going back through Shinto and the influence of Confucianism, Taoism and Buddhism over the last 2,000 years, and through their language, because their kanji characters are pictograms, they've, you know, Kaizen, if you break down the image in the kanji characters, it's self-flagellation at an altar. So it's self-sacrifice, basically. It's about trying to improve yourself. And we totally miss that. But that's the kind of deep meaning that sits in the Japanese language that we fail to really translate in the West. So, you know, building people before we build cars means they've got this connection in their head, this intuitive knowledge, that semantic construct in their brains and the way their brains process language that says this means we support each other. This is an emotional thing, you know, and that is apparent if you watch videos on Japanese schooling systems, when the way teachers interact with the kids around bereavement and all sorts of different social dynamics. So it really is ingrained in the culture, and that's kind of what's missing for us in the West a little bit. So when we start breaking things down, you know, and again, QCD, right, quality cost delivery, we all know that one. But when I was first trained in the early 90s in anything to do with world-class manufacturing, as it was still called, that acronym was a bit broader. It was quality cost delivery, growth, safety, morale, you know, QCD, GSM. And that's what I was brought up to consider. And then, you know, when we put this people bit in the middle of that and realize that there's this real focus on people in the culture, you realize that the processes and systems, you know, they don't do anything unless somebody comes along and turns them on and presses the button. So we've got this real focus on process improvement, systems, technology, and we seem to forget that it's the people bit, the brain function, that's the only reactive, you know, live part of the whole process. And we're having an effect on that depending on what we do with process and systems. So if we consider it like that and we look through that lens at it, we can look at the Toyota way, again, going back to Fujio Cho in the early 2000s, and look at that foundation piece that he pulled together and published, and really dig into what some of these words mean. So, you know, as I understand it, I don't know if you guys know, but my business partner used to be president of Toyota in Turkey, and he worked for him for 16 years. He went to Japan to do his training. He speaks fluent Japanese. So I've got a bit of an inside track on some of this stuff that, you know, I'm privileged to have. But challenge is more about challenging self, right? It's about, and I think, you know, if you go back to Mark Warren's version of the TPS handbook, 1973, you can see Taiichi Ohno doing this, because he talks about in that book, taking a moment, pausing, thinking about his own biases and his own thinking patterns, and trying to stop him before he goes onto the shop floor and talks to the engineers, because he doesn't want to go in with any preconceived ideas about what the problem is or what the solution is. He wants to go in and listen. So that's the kind of challenge we need to apply to ourselves. And like I said, Kaizen is self-improvement as well. So once you've challenged yourself and you've seen where you've got opportunities to improve, Kaizen is the commitment to improve it at a personal level. And then, of course, Genji Genbutsu, you go to the place, and that's, for us, it's about, if you go to the place where other people are at in their heads, where they're operating from, their language register that's been imprinted by life, and their emotional responses to challenge and sensory stimulus, then you start to get to this point where you can really consider what does it mean to develop people, to grow people and build people. And it's to be there with them and to help them understand why, out of respect for them and wanting to improve their quality of life and respect for humanity, i.e. how brains work, what can we do to help them continuously improve and contribute more to be a part of a team. So, the interpretation of this can look very different once you start adding the biology and the neuroscience to it. So keeping going with that whole idea, then, we all see these pillar-led houses, and I know they come from Toyota originally. And the ones that I first saw had tools and techniques as the sort of foundation layers. And then, the pillars inside Toyota are pretty much JIT and Jidoka, right? So keep building and make sure nothing ever stops anything. And then sometimes there's a roof on it, sometimes there's not. But if it is, it's usually Hoshin Kanri or some kind of coordination method, right? And that's, for me, that's G, that's the practice from a Japanese perspective. It's what you're doing. And what we seem to have missed is what sits behind that, which we've just explored, because those are the principles, right? The principles of self-improvement, challenging yourself, going to where it happens in heads and physically, and respecting people so that you improve teamwork. But behind that sits this philosophy, this automatic assumption, this belief, if you like, which is this word Hitozukuri, about building people. So we break that down a little bit, then you're talking about the overarching belief in leaders being that the organization's success depends on the continuous growth of the people, and therefore that's why developing people is a priority, because they see it as root cause of the organization's success. And again, I don't think we make that connection quite so clearly, especially in English speaking worlds. Growth, going back to that idea of, what does it mean to develop from a personal point of view and from a Japanese perspective, I think you probably use words like fostering character, adaptability, and deep engagement. And I'll talk a bit more about engagement in a minute. But really, you can see why, when you look at it like that, you've got this phrase, as Leica put when he detailed the 14 points for the Toyota way, that the first principle at the very top of it all is, long-term management decisions must prevail even at the expense of short-term financial gain. And that really comes from this belief that short-term metrics and the conflict between logical approach to profit, get stuff out the door, really conflicts with that long-term people development issue, unless the leaders are well versed in what it means to support people and that psychology and neuroscience behind it. So that's kind of how it all sort of stacks up for me. So if we look at it through that lens, the key thing we want to do is build self-awareness first, because leaders have got to recognize that neural wiring and their own belief systems sit at root cause of their own behaviors and reactions, which is the BTFA model. Okay, so we've created that experience to make sure leaders can reshape their beliefs and really align with sort of different guiding principles about what's going to lead to a high performance culture. And we're seeing it in practice now, because we've been doing this for a couple of years and actually teaching people about neuroscience, and some of the stuff I've just flashed over really does lead to higher engagement and better motivation, because motivation obviously is another chemical process in the brain linked to dopamine and reward circuits and all that kind of stuff. So, if once we get people understanding this and we introduce this new language of neuroscience to help us bridge that cultural gap to principles and philosophy, then we really start getting that better alignment between company culture and leadership behaviors, and we're really starting to see the benefits with the clients now. So I'll just touch on that in a second as well. But the missing piece, as far as I'm concerned, if you go back to the Toyota way, this is another way that it's drawn. I mean, you go to the Toyota website and you see it looking like this. But I think what we've done in the West is focused on this bit, and the misinterpretation of Kaizen as, you know, a project management approach and a 5-step model to execute a project or whatever else it's been turned into. And we call it best practice, right? And that's led to these reports of 75 to 90% of change programs failing. And the Gallup stats, I'm not sure I've got them in this presentation, but, you know, there's 79% average disengagement levels globally being reported for the last few years by big studies, Gallup and others. And it's all because we're not getting this, you know, chemical shift brain neurological bit right under the banner of best practice that's been completely, you know, ignorant of it for decades. So again, what we're doing, prioritize the focus on the respect for people bit, the principles bit, and explain that to Western brains with the science to back it up. And we're getting, you know, really fantastic results. And obviously that's what, for us, sits behind the 90-year track record of continuous improvement for Toyota. So that's sort of bringing it all together as much as I can. I think, you know, we don't want to work at this top line level anymore. I don't know why Axe has gone like that in PDC in the middle, but you can see, you know, we focus on process systems and logic and apply models like Deming's PDCA cycle or PDSA cycle, and you're only going to get so far. And so if we add the people bit in and realize that we're talking, when we say people, we mean brains and brain function, and we get that neurological bit to prop up the people piece, then, you know, you stabilize everything else you can do when it comes to process and systems, because they all rely on interactions with people. So, you know, that's the model that really summarizes it all. It's not just about logic, it's about emotion as well. And we've got to try and get that balance right. Because if we do, then, you know, we move beyond compliance, where we're only getting to a certain point of performance in any organization because it's about control and standardization and all the things that the brain's not responding brilliantly to, and actually working with the brain instead of against it with this new knowledge, and increasing commitment and engagement, which takes performance up a lot further than it currently is for most, and which Toyota has been enjoying for a long time. So just wrapping up with a few figures then, we get this stuff wrong, and we don't develop people, we don't focus on people, we don't practice Hitozukuri as a management philosophy or a leadership philosophy, then it can have a real negative impact on performance. So you can see here, Christine Porath did a study on incivility, and people cut back their efforts just when people are being rude to each other, right? Especially bosses to subordinates. People cut back efforts by 66%, 80% took more time off work. And what's fascinating is it's not just the direct impact, it's the indirect impact. So when other people who weren't directly being, you know, rude, whose boss weren't being rude to them, when they saw their colleagues and a boss being rude to them or somebody being rude to them, that led to 45% fewer improvement ideas, and their effort dropped 25% as well. So, you know, we really, this whole idea of culture being about relationship and relationship being an output of brain function really starts to link to, you know, performance and profit. And the more leaders know about this, the more they want to act in line with doing something proactive about it, rather than just keep going through their own autopilot responses and contributing to the problem. To make matters a lot worse, you know, on a 10-year study of 370 working class families, Maureen Perry Jenkins, a psychology professor from Massachusetts, she found out that when you're micromanaged, when you're controlled at work, when you feel repressed, when you can't exercise, what do psychologists call it, self-determination theory, right? You don't have agency over yourself. Neurologically, what that means is you're not setting goals and not making progress towards goals of your own volition, and therefore dopamine levels are low, changes the chemical construct in the brain, and therefore your actions, your output, because of that changing chemical mix, isn't good when you're interacting with your kids. So you go home, you don't engage with your kids, putting it simply. And those children have been shown through this study to go on and have worse math skills, worse social skills, more arguments and fights, behavioural problems, and lower level life outcomes. They go into the working population at a lower level and stay at that lower level for the rest of their lives. So, you know, this we've got such a responsibility as leaders to do what's best for people, and in that statement we mean to be aware of and do what's best for brain and brain function. All right, but we've also got a 70% negativity bias, so we don't want to focus too much on the negative because we have too much of that in our life already. Let's focus on the positive and what happens if we get it right. Okay, if we get high engagement and trust because we are triggering that right chemical response in brains, then we're going to get high performance. Simple as that. And Paul Zak, who's a neuroscientist out in the States, you know, he did a 10-year study whilst he was a practicing neuroscientist for 16 years before he went off and developed this wearable technology for engagement testing and oxytocin measurement on the back of the neck. And he came up with these statistics, like 74% less stress, and we said earlier about the negative impact stress has, 50% higher productivity. I mean, you don't need to go any further than that, right? That's it. If you can get 50% higher productivity because you get your work with brains instead of against them, and you get people engaged, and by that word engaged we mean triggering the release of dopamine and other chemicals that give you that extra boost of energy and stuff, then also people enjoy what they're doing, so they get 40% less burnout, right? So you got all those brilliant statistics, you know, lower sick days, everything else that trouble us at work, because we create the right culture. And I think this is, you know, going back to Hitozukuri, that's what the Japanese understand intuitively. We haven't been able to understand that through what's been communicated and the translation of language up till now. And for me, neuroscience just brings it all out into the open. So, you know, again, Gallup studies 112,000 business units just to make it substantial in the world. And we see, you know, the big ones I've highlighted there, 23% higher profitability in organizations that have got top quartile engagement compared to organizations with bottom quartile engagement. So it really is, you know, the case that today we're able to start linking this issue of engagement and brain function to bottom line performance. And obviously that would also affect the way we approach strategy as well. So it's not just a case of the logic saying we want the objectives, we want the goals, we want the actions, we want the KPIs. It's a case of recognizing imposed KPIs are another source of stress for people that haven't chosen them for themselves or had any part in understanding why they're there. And so when we talk about Hoshin Kanri and catchball is the bit that actually works, because it's that going to people and showing them that they're valued and that they're, you know, the experts are the people that do the job. You know, that old catchphrase from the lean world. You go and talk to the people because their brains have had to map every day for however many years they've worked there, that process and what they do. And they know, you know, whether this grinding wheel works against that metal or not, and all the things that you don't see at the end of an Excel sheet. So again, back to Genji Gumbutsu and Gemba, but going through the catchball process is really, if we can talk about it in terms of showing respect, but actually it's taking proactive action to give the inbound sensory stimulus to a brain to trigger a response that contributes in a way that we can, you know, take on board as leaders and adjust our course to make sure that we've got the most fluid and flexible responsive strategy to the market conditions at any one moment in time. And it, you know, it starts to really change how we see what we've got to do, and it's less about an X matrix and more about the catchball process and the human connection and interaction that allows your investors to get their return on investment and allows the customers and consumers to get the quality product they want when they want it. But there's that whole piece in the middle about the human brains and how they connect. Again, you know, Hitozukuri, if people aren't emotionally mature enough and developed enough to be able to work in that way, that's the job at hand, is to develop the people, you know. And unless we get that right, we're not going to get the culture right. We're going to get a lot of that insecure fear of failure and rejection based responses, you know, and that means infighting, you know, conflicting KPIs, departments pulling in different directions and fighting, blaming each other, and all the stuff we see in business all over the world. We're not going to get rid of that until we deal with the brain aspect, and we're not going to do that until leaders believe that the brain's got a part to play in all this and know enough about it. So here's another quick video. Just this is GK in Aerospace, the Senior Vice President of Global Transformation, Philip Holt, and a chat he was having with me and my business partner at an event with his right-hand man at the time, Edwin Vanderberg. And it was just, if you just listen to what Philip's saying, and it kind of sums it all up.
And then this area, as you said. Yeah. No, but it's fantastic, Levent, and again, thank you. Great explanation around that. And what I really like about it is it allows a different kind of dialogue in teams. So just yesterday, I was on a call about some support we're giving in one of our factories, and we talked about all of the logical work that's been done for the past year or so in terms of how we should redesign the value stream and how we can get rates up and be more effective. And the conclusion was that the work done is already great. You know, there's nothing logically that needs to be done anymore. It really is. And the language people were using, you know, it was one of my team members said, it's just the BTFA hasn't been there. And they started talking about how do we get the BTFA there? How do we get the belief in this being the right thing to do and to change well-established ways of working, and a belief, you know, without going into details, a belief that you've just got to keep the machines running, so we've got to keep packing inventory behind them. And if we've got a machine that's working, let's make stuff on it regardless of whether there's flow in the value stream. So changing that belief, as you say, Levent, through actions, through experiences, is where they're starting to focus the change on, because they don't need to do any more analysis, they don't need to do any more logic. But it's just beautiful to hear people starting, fundamentally engineers starting to talk about BTFA and how do we inject the BTFA into what we're doing, and that must be really nice for you to hear, David. If you can see, you can probably see the hairstyle.
Anyway, so there you go. We get the point. I mean, it's when people understand the brain stuff, they start talking about it proactively, because going all the way back to the first video, there's a language register wired into their brains that they can access, right? And if you haven't introduced anything to do with brain function to anybody, it's not there to access. So you can't have that conversation. You can't even ask the right questions. And you know, you go back to the old saying, what is it? What am I thinking of? My brain's just completely run into a brick wall. What's the saying when you say knowing the problem is half the solution? I think that's what I'm trying to say. And if we can't describe the problem, then we're never going to get anywhere near the solution. But yeah, showing what happened at Toyota, at GKN. This is sort of representative data, but the more the orange color gets darker, the more the leadership teams were getting ingrained and thinking about brains through the BTFA model. Oh, sorry, it jumped. And these diagonal lines were their sort of development prediction through their 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 phase deployment model. And this was the top dotted line was the sort of higher level performance they thought they might be able to achieve. And you can see that, you know, the people that got through with the highest level of brain awareness started to outperform every prediction. Same thing with Toyota Bashuku. We helped them with their Hoshin Canry, and their Great Place to Work engagement survey jumped 12% in year. And the reason why that's important is because we talk about it hitting the bottom line. There's lots of stuff here to read. I'm not going to go through it. It's basically what Philip said in his book that he wrote and all sorts. But there's the key figure that, you know, 7% increase on prediction to £410 million, which was 8% higher than prior expectations issued. And that's reported in the Times by JP Morgan Casanovas. You know, so it really does have a tangible impact. I think Philip managed to get those results in about 4 years when lower results were predicted in about 7. So you get the people bit right, and the rate of change, the progress you can make in a whole organization accelerates as well. And you can imagine saving 3 years on a change program, how much money that would save. It's just staggering. It really is. And it's all about getting the people bit right. You know, we get the same sort of testimony. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but from other big companies that you probably would have heard of, you know. And even after 30 years, you know, Frank said it shifted the way I think after. So you can change beliefs if you understand brain function, and ultimately you get to a point where You know, whereas we can say the negative, which is change can't be successful if you don't get the support of the people. You can, from a Hitozukuri perspective, and linking that with neuroscience, understand what it means, how you've got to be, how you're going to go about leadership to get that support of your people. And when you do that, everything gets better. I mean, apart from graphics that go off the bottom of the page on the right hand side there. So anyway, that's it. I mean, that's kind of the way I'm seeing the world these days after that 30 years of study and 40 years of experience, and hopefully it made sense. But let me come back across to you guys and stop presenting and we can have a chat. But yeah, it makes sense. I mean, there's a few minutes before the hour. I don't want you to try and wrap up ahead of time so we could at least say hello and have a chat. But yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, it makes sense to me, David. I've been a huge believer in neuroscience since learning about Toyota Kata, because we talk about human capabilities and neural pathways and how they connect to our daily patterns and our habits, I should say. Now the one question I have here, and with the introduction of AI now, we seem to be more and more reliant on technology these days because we want quick answers, and we seem to be using less and less of those neural transmitters. How do you see AI playing a role with all this, whether it's negative or positive, and how could it affect the future in terms of leadership and personal development? And
there's profound potential for it to be negative, but equal potential for it to be positive. So it is about whether we can develop an understanding of, like we said, that outcome objective of developing brain function. If we all make that our outcome objective and we use AI to enhance that, it will be amazing, because it could inform teachers on how to educate kids. It could inform trainers on how to best educate people in business and vocational stuff, because it can help explain what we've got to do to trigger that emotional response to get brains to adapt. So there's loads of ways it can be used if we know what to ask it. But equally, what I've seen over the last 10 years is this pattern of gamification and just more bells and whistles on technology. And what we know now is that that's preying on your attention, right? So attention comes from the prefrontal cortex. You need the right levels of acetylcholine as a different neurotransmitter to be able to make it function, the way it should. But there's all this other chemical component to it. So if we've got notifications on LinkedIn or Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever else it is, and that little red dot is trying to get our attention, it also comes with reward. So if we think we've got another thumbs up, another like on some app we're using, or our company has asked us to use an app that's got even more notifications, it's either going to be artificially rewarding if you want to get a like, or it's going to be stressful. And one way or another, what that does is it produces too much dopamine, and then the postsynaptic cell, the receiving cell of too much dopamine, will start to shut down. And that's the sort of basis behind addiction cycles. So you have your first bit of chocolate, it tastes fantastic because it's got sugar. Sugar triggers the release of dopamine. You go and have another bit of chocolate, it doesn't give you the same rush, because the cells involved in that pleasurable experience in your brain have already started shutting down against too much dopamine triggered by the sugar. So you then eat the whole bar trying to find the same rush, and because you can't get it, it becomes stressful, increases cortisol levels, and elevated dopamine and cortisol depletes serotonin, and serotonin is required in the prefrontal cortex for keeping the brakes on, so we don't overthink, because overthinking links to anxiety and depression. So you've got this really easy neurochemical link to make between gamification, attention grabbing apps, too much stimulus, and the chemical response that ultimately can lead to a lower quality of life and depression. So I think we've got to be very careful with what we do and inform our approach to what we do with any kind of technological advancement in context and in light of what we now know about brain function. And I think we've got a responsibility to do the best job we can to support people with it and not damage people with it, which is the most likely outcome, just because we don't know what we're doing. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that did, Dave. Thanks. Great presentation, by the way. The only other thing I might ask is standardization. We often say is absolutely necessarily important in order to improve based on the current condition, but also if problems do come up, it gives us a base as to look back and see where problems might have occurred. When we talk about neuroscience and how the brain works and developing people, do you see standardization playing a role for leaders and organizations to support with understanding people better in terms of what motivates them, in terms of why aren't they getting our current instructions on how to do the process, anything related to continuous improvement that you might have seen?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. Again, you've got to understand what brains need and what they need to thrive, and versus what they rebel against to survive. And it comes back to this issue of inclusion, the same with catchball, right? If you give a human brain exposure to a need to do something that they've got a vested interest in developing, so you can say, if we can improve our quality through standards, then the business is going to be safer in the market, and therefore your job's protected, right? These are the kind of links that people don't really make for themselves, because they're too not seeing the wood for the trees, because they're lost in the stress of their own life. So if we give them the opportunity to participate in what would be a good standard and why, then, and we get back into purpose and goal-seeking mechanisms again. If a human brain can use its imagination to predict a future state and recognize that future state is good for self, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, self-determination theory, then when they make progress towards that, that's the natural level trigger of dopamine. And dopamine is the chemical that sits behind motivation, seeking mechanisms, and all that kind of stuff. So it links into goal setting, it links into leadership conduct, it leads into job rotation, exposure to higher level issues, inclusion, basically what it boils down to. Include people, value them for their opinion of their scope of experience that their brain's been exposed to, and help them understand how that fits into the big picture, coming back to Hoshin-Kanri and why that works so well, because you see your part, you play in the whole process. And what you'll do is you'll give people the capacity to connect with the reasons why standards that they help to construct are necessary to defend quality, cost, delivery, and therefore sales and reputation in the market. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is the brain, to be safe in its knowledge that it's okay to operate in its swim lane, needs boundaries, right? So, and the brain can derive confidence from that. So if people understand why the standard is there and they want to exercise within that standard, their actions, then they can relax a little bit. So it's less metabolically taxing from a glucose energy point of view, and their brain can go to work on problem solving, innovation, and actually find ways to improve that process, because it's standardized and they know that that's okay, everybody's approved, it's socially acceptable to operate with that standard for now. And therefore, because they're more relaxed and their brain's in a different chemical state, they innovate better, they collaborate better, and therefore you get more continuous improvement. So standardization can have all these positive impacts through this neuroscience lens. And in terms of leader standard work, you know, if there's a way that we could standardize conduct, and you going back to the PORAF studies in incivility, if that means don't be rude to people, don't lose your temper, regulate your own emotions because you understand your own brain and you've been, you know, on courses like ours to develop your self-awareness, then you will conduct yourself in ways that you can consider a standard that contributes to achieving a high performance culture. If you're not aware of any of that and you can't standardize your own behaviors as a leadership team in terms of how you're going to conduct yourself, how you're going to communicate, how you're going to deploy strategy, how you're going to introduce change and run and do change management and project management, then the receiving brains of all those mixed messages can't predict, and the brain's a prediction machine. It needs to know what's coming next. So if it can't, it's going to be so much more stressed out, and all the negatives that come with stress and high glucose consumption rates through insecurity and being unsure are going to play out. So, you know, various ways that word standardization plays into all different levels of organizational conduct, approach, deployment, action, practice. And it all comes back down to, you know, are you contributing to the way the brain works, or are you detracting from it? And unfortunately, in the absence of neuroscience for the last 50 odd years, a lot of what we do under the banner of best practice detracts from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you look at implementation failures that you might have seen over the past, you can definitely see the link where they failed to make that human connection with either the people doing the job or connecting leadership to the people that are doing the job, whatever it might be. And I agree, catchballs is a great process. And I think with anything that we do in the continuous improvement world and lean and people development, you definitely have to include the people doing the job, right? They have to understand what's in it for me. Why is this going to help me do my job better? Why is it going to help me better as a person? Whatever, right? So,
yeah, definitely. Yeah, connection and like I say, the brain is designed to survive efficiently and predict its outcomes so it can survive efficiently, and it only adapts its neural wiring and firing pattern to improve its prediction capability. So if the environment you put it in is unpredictable, because you never know when the boss is going to lose his temper next or whatever else it might be, that brain's not going to do well. It's not going to be in the sort of energy and chemical state in the right areas you need it to be to do the things that you actually want to do, which is innovating, problem solving, you know, being focused, making sure the quality is right, acting in a safe manner, and all those key things, and being engaged, right? You can't engage if you're uncertain of how the people around you are going to react because they're stressed out. So, you know, it's the whole thing is, for me, it just always comes back down to brain function. If we just knew more about that and reverse engineered back from that to inform practice, we would get so much more right, and we would have such high performing businesses everywhere.
absolutely makes sense to me.
Brilliant. Craig, have you got anything did you want to say or ask, mate, before we sign off?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that. The information is so helpful, useful. It's amazing to think how much of the brain we don't think of and we don't use every day, right? So once you start to understand a little bit more, you think, oh, maybe it's how I'm asking questions, or maybe it's what I'm assuming you already know or understand, right? So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
No, my pleasure, mate. No, and it is that we're so lost in our own assumption all the time, and it's so almost impossible, but not impossible, difficult to see in ourselves. And it is about looking at the man in the mirror and what, you know, I can't affect your brain. You can affect your brain based on how you process inbound sensory stimulus. I can only affect my brain. I can only regulate my behavioral responses. I can't do that for anybody else, and nobody else can make me do it. And it's that self-awareness of, you know, what am I outputting based on how my brain's been formed by life, that becomes the input to somebody else, and that's going to trigger their response. And unless we start thinking along those lines, we haven't got much chance of improving very much at all, because, you know, you can put all the CapEx in place and train all the tools and techniques you want, and it's not going to make any difference to the way that person who had that particular upbringing through childhood and that particular bully at school in that particular environment is reacting from a fear of failure and rejection point of view to imposed KPIs, and unless we deal with that and bring it out into the open and stop hiding from it, we're just going to keep going around in the same circles we've been going around for decades. And it's such a shame because we've got the science to know better and we can do better, but we're still fighting the brain in as much as it's new. Therefore, it's a threat until proven innocent, right? It's guilty until proven innocent. So we say neuroscience to people in continuous improvement circles, and the most common response is, what the hell's that got to do with anything? Because it's their brain responding in the way they don't know yet, So it's fascinating to watch once you see it. Frustrating because I'd love to have more traction in the world globally with this whole concept. But yeah, it's not going to go away, and we're only going to get better at it. And I think in 200 years' time, we'll be talking about brain function, and the anterior cingulate cortex and all these different parts, the same way as we talk about valves in the heart, and we don't think anything of it. But 200 years ago, nobody knew what an aorta was or a ventricle, and now we do. So it's only a case of exposure over time. Now that we've got the technology to introduce us to the science, and we can start really understanding ourselves and each other much better. And when we do, we just become more empathetic. Because I'll just say one more thing that I've said to others in a couple of other calls this week. If you think about it, right, every brain, although we saw that map of the words on top being slightly different for everybody, but the reason it's only slightly different is because everything that sits underneath the cerebral cortex, all the component parts of the brain are the same for everybody. Right, so we've all got two hemispheres, all three of us on this call, and every other 7 billion people on the planet. Right? We've all got a corpus callosum joining them. We've all got hippocampus and pituitary gland and thalamus and hypothalamus and amygdala and pons and list of all the names of the things in the brain. We've all got one of each, right, or two of each, because they sit in each hemisphere. So that means that, the insecurity you felt when you didn't get picked for the football team, and I felt when I didn't get picked for the rugby team, and I was the last one standing in line, and and the girl rejected us, or the boy rejected the girl, or that moment of being caught out because you've done something wrong and you've lied because you're a kid, and you do because you're insecure and you want to try and make an impression. And we've all done it. We've all had that gut churning fall out of your backside kind of fear. We've all had that insecurity and imposter syndrome, and we all do on a regular basis. I've done talks all around the world on stage for so many years now, and I still have to go through a little mental exercise to calm my nerves before I walk on stage and start talking. So it's natural, and it's because of the way the brain functions. And when we get that, we can be so much more empathetic towards each other and give people the support we need and the arm around the shoulder and the encouragement to say, hey, it doesn't matter if you made a mistake. We all do. Come on, how are we going to fix it? How are we going to go forward from this point forward? What can you learn from it? Rather than going, you idiot, do you know how much this has cost the business? Because the person's beating themselves up enough because of the way their brain's designed to do that, to survive. We don't need to add to the problem, and that's when we go away from command and control and bullying and gaslighting and all the issues that we hear about so regularly in business, and we go towards an empathetic, encouraging culture. And again, go back to Toyota as the exemplar in this space. They're the ones that protected everybody's jobs through COVID. They're the ones that put everybody at home on 60% pay, guaranteed there would be no redundancies, depending on how long it went on for. And they're the ones that bounced back and responded best when the restrictions started getting lifted and were back to profit quicker than everybody else in the world, because they protected their people. And that's when you really, when the market shifts and the profit margins fall, the companies that get this right protect their people. The companies that get it wrong run a redundancy program and protect the bottom line and the margin. And that's the difference. And so you can see that 99% of the companies in the world try and do that profit protection first rather than people protection. And I just hope that neuroscience gives us the capacity to understand why that doesn't work and why we keep shooting ourselves in the foot at a cultural level. And in the future, we'll have companies that are actually there to be communities and to contribute to community and be part of society in a positive way, rather than just, allowing people to exist at a tick along level that's okay because it makes the boss a bit more money than the people he employs. It's just not what we need to do from a humanitarian point of view, and it's just becoming more and more obvious the more science we throw at it. So anyway, that's me. I better get off my soapbox and let you guys go.
Yeah, I'll just leave you with this thought, David. I was just recently talking to someone about speaking to one of the high schools about a particular topic. Have you ever thought about introducing this sort of thing at the early ages before kids get into the workforce? Because as I always say, it's best to plug the holes first and make sure that what's coming down the pipe is what we want to see for our future. Right? Yeah.
Absolutely, I have, mate. It's always been my ambition. Long story that I won't go into now, but my own childhood, some of the things I saw, went through, and recognised that I've seen people in a close circle of friends and relations live absolute car crash lives because of abuse and bits and pieces. So I know that this is a life sentence if you get it wrong in the early days. And I've always said my strategy is to, work with the commercial world because that's where the money moves. And then once we get to a point where that's okay and sustainable, then I want to invest in, whatever version of this needs to be developed to get to parents, to get to kids in primary school, secondary school, the teachers, and sports coaches and all the people that, that saying it takes a village to raise a child. We need to make sure everybody in that village, the adults, understand what they've got to do to protect those children, and those brains, and get them to adulthood in the best possible way they can. And my mum said it. I'm the youngest of 7, and she always said, "You've got to protect their innocence, Dave. You must protect their innocence." And what she meant is, don't flood brains with too much crap from the world too early on, because they're still developing and evolving. They've got to get to a point where they've got self-confidence and a high self-concept before, using psychological terms, but they've got an established wiring and firing pattern that's conducive to being able to conduct themselves well in the world from a neurological perspective. And that's what we get wrong, and parents get it wrong. And just one quick last thing, Jen Fraser, brilliant PhD literature analyst from Canada, she wrote a book called The Bullied Brain, and she worked with a neuroscientist called Michael Merzenich, who developed Brain HQ for 10 years to write this book. And I was supporting her in an interview about the book, and she said something that I've now written in the front of my book, but I'm just currently trying to write because everybody keeps telling me I should do. She said, I was the deputy head teacher in a private school in Canada for 30 years. She said, not once was I taught anything about the organ I was there to affect. And I thought, wow, if that doesn't just sum it all up? If teachers don't know anything about brains, and educators in industry don't know anything about brains, and yet learning is the adaptation of a brain, how silly is that we've got this massive disconnect between how we talk in the language we use and the fact that it doesn't allow us to connect with neural function, and the development of that, and the optimum ways of developing that. So for me, mate, to answer your question, I want to get this developed to a point successfully through industry to get some money together so that it can go in front of parents, kids, teachers, sports coaches, everybody, and the NHS, and healthcare and whatever else it might be. That's the objective. I've got about, if I want to retire at some point, I've got about 10 or 15 years to crack on and get it done. So we'll see, but that's the objective, definitely. And it works because I've got an 8-year-old downstairs, and he's already talking in these terms because he's grown up listening to me do calls like this. So
absolutely, it's definitely needed in today's world, David. So I applaud you for that. Anyways, gentlemen, it's been great. Thanks for the educational insight on our brains here, David.
Thank you, mate.
You never learn enough about the brain, that's for sure.
No, I get bored so quickly. It's kept me going for 20 plus years already. So it's an infinite source of interest. It really is.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks,
all
mate.
Right, gentlemen. Take care.
Thanks, Dave.
All right.
Yeah.
Bye.